Cryptid Company, written by Paige Turner. The horror of romance. It's hard to be a romance novelist when your life is full of horror, but hey, sometimes you gotta follow the contracts. My real mistake was going full brooding author after the divorce. I moved clear across the country to ensure I never accidentally ran into Mark or any of our old friends again, and I bought a cozy house in the middle of nowhere. It's on the outskirts of a national forest, and the closest town is almost an hour away. There are a few hunting clubs nearby, but they're all abandoned this time of year. The soil is supposed to be useless for farming, so I got a great deal on 5 acres. I don't really have plans for it. I just wanted to keep hunters at a fair distance. There's not much of a clearing around my home, but I'm having some smaller trees removed soon. I need a wider field of vision, plus some shotguns, security cameras, and an electric fence, maybe some landmines. But bitter paranoia aside, it's a beautiful spot. I thought it would help me recover from the irony of writing a love story while it feels like my heart is being pushed through a shredder. But if anything, it only makes things worse, which is why I'm writing this instead of deciding how Cassidy will first meet Christopher. Just once, I'd like to decide how Cassidy murders Christopher. Sorry, that was a little dark. I don't fantasize about killing Mark, just to be clear. I only mean that it's hard to write about something you don't believe in. Not that I believe you should murder people, I just really don't believe in love. It's nothing but a bunch of chemicals flooding the brain with bad decisions. Look, I'm only trying to express some of these emotions before I drown, okay? It's bad enough I'm losing my mind out here. The last thing I need is for the police to show up asking if I've ever thought of harming myself or others. The answer is no, for the record. At least not outside of the literary sense. I'm a writer. Give me a break. Rebellious imaginations are how we process. Or maybe I've finally cracked, and I'm having full-blown hallucinations. There's no history of mental illness in my family, but I've been under an extraordinary amount of stress. I wouldn't be surprised to wake up in a straitjacket with some stuffy doctor asking, "What's the last thing you remember?" I wasn't exactly a poster girl for sanity before this. No writers are, but I never questioned the very fabric of reality until my first night in this house. A friend recommended writing down everything that's happened from start to finish in as much detail as possible. It's supposed to help me organize my thoughts in a way that makes them easier to understand. My hopes aren't exactly high, but screw it. Why the hell not? It doesn't really matter how much time I spend on this anyway. That's the thing about romance novels. No one gives a shit how Cassidy and Christopher meet. They only want to hear about what happens when the clothes come off. I once changed how the main character spelled his name halfway through a book, and not one person noticed. Not even my editor. I guess I'm not exactly thrilled at the prospect of reliving the last several weeks, but I'm desperate enough to try anything. So let's get this show on the road. Munchkin or Crane. The moving trucks came out 2 days ahead of me, and the furniture was already in the place when I arrived. The boxes were the only thing left to deal with, and I settled for unpacking the necessities as they were needed. The spare bedroom is full of junk that will probably still be packed when I'm ready to return to civilization. I arrived at 9 on a Saturday morning and immediately began converting the dining room into my new office. The windows overlook the creek entering the lush forest, and that first day, it seemed to pull the words from me like the days before I became a rotting husk of cynicism. However, any sense of serenity granted by the peaceful scenery quickly evaporated with a strange, high-pitched... how do you even describe it? I've heard it at least half a dozen times, but it never gets easier to define. It's not a scream or a cry. It's not like that weird predator clicking noise either. It's more like the screech of nails on a chalkboard, only more, primal. If you can imagine a primal chalkboard. Look, I said I don't know. I really don't. That's the point. What matters is that I spent the entire day absorbed in a fantasy world that I wanted nothing to do with in the first place, only to come out of it hearing some ungodly, horrifying sound that made my blood run cold and sent sweat dripping down my spine. I looked up to see it was now dark. I had no idea when that had happened, and the patio bulbs were dead. Replacing them was absolutely out of the question. Nothing could have convinced me to open the door right then. I hadn't bothered buying curtains yet either, and the only thing I could see through the window was my own reflection. That was the most unnerving part. That noise was so loud that whatever caused it had to be close by. My heart skipped a few beats as I imagined what might be out there, looking in at me plain as day. Eventually, I forced myself into action, turned off the lights to minimize the view inside, but I didn't expect to see anything myself. Yet, for a fraction of a second, my reflection disappeared, and I saw two glowing red eyes set into a hulking humanoid shape, not 20 yards away. The stars provided just enough illumination to distinguish the pitch-black figure from the background before it disappeared into the tree line. Then I was left staring through my transparent reflection, wondering just how real that moment had been. It's amazing how one begins to question their own sanity when logic is threatened. Had those red orbs really been eyes? Was it really something on two legs? I keep thinking about the Wizard of Oz. There's an urban legend that one of the Munchkins actually hung themselves on set, and the footage made it past all the post-production edits. The supposedly fatal moment occurs after the Tin Man joins Dorothy and the Scarecrow. If you focus on the background as the three characters skip away, you'll see a large shadow seemingly rise and drop. Now, if the idea of a hanging munchkin has been implanted in your mind, that may be what it looks like. But if you know the studio had several large birds running around that day, it suddenly becomes very clear that a crane is spreading and folding its wings. I'm aware those two things don't sound like they are very similar, but there's clips all over YouTube if you want to see it for yourself. Basically, that's just a roundabout way of saying I wasn't sure if I really saw what I thought I saw, Were those red eyes? I was already one stub toe away from a full mental breakdown, and now I had to wonder if I was hallucinating. Well, spoiler alert, I wasn't. That night, I hung blankets over every window and went to bed. I only had screws to get the job done, but you can't argue with the results. Mark kept the cats, but even their combined efforts wouldn't be a match for my redneck curtains. In some regards, I'm adapting to country life just fine. Sound sleep. I spent the next day buying and installing motion-detecting floodlights. I was pleased with myself for presumably outsmarting my new nemesis. But I failed to anticipate the numerous false alarms wildlife would cause. I was getting up every 5 minutes, usually just in time to see a raccoon disappear into the forest. But my determination had doubled since the night before. I wanted pictures that would prove I didn't get all worked up over a black bear. I might not know much, but I know black bears don't have red eyes. Sadly, that whole night was a bust, unless you count experiencing my first case of sleep paralysis. It's been happening at least 2 or 3 times a week ever since, and I gotta say, I'm not a fan. I went to bed at midnight, and since my clock projects the time onto the ceiling, I know it was 3:30 when something woke me up. I was lying on my back, trying to remember what I heard when the strange screeching noise from the night before made my insides recoil with pure dread. It sounded like it was coming from right outside the window. I tried to sit up, but I couldn't. The pins and needles sensation of a sleeping foot. That's how my entire body felt. My sight was restricted to solely what I could see without moving my head, but by focusing my vision to the far left, I was just able to make out the window. An old white sheet still acted as a curtain, but it was thin, and the floodlights were clearly visible behind it. Had it not been for the sound and the tall, hulking shadow outlined in the sheet's center, I would have blamed another animal for setting them off. The pricks of pins and needles increased tenfold as I struggled to move, but it was as useless as trying to maintain my focus on the window. My eyes ached with the strain, but I couldn't look away. Somehow my thoughts turned to Mark and how he was likely asleep in that model's arms. A model, for Christ's sake. She doesn't even know how to pump her own gas. Sorry, not important, but that's what I thought about while staring at the mystery shape. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep because it was suddenly daylight, and I could move again. I leapt out of bed in a hurry to check outside, and though I didn't find any footprints, I did find something much more horrifying. My bedroom window was somehow cracked open, but I'm positive that they were all locked when I went to sleep. The wood was chipped at the bottom, like someone crammed their nails into the tiny crack and managed to force it open. I really don't know what to make of it. When I re-engaged the lock, it seemed to work fine. Unfortunately, I've never thrived under pressure, so I didn't think to screw the window shut until the next incident, but I'll get to that shortly. Things were actually normal for the remainder of that week, unless you count a few unusually vivid nightmares. I mean the regular kind this time. Though it's debatable if one would label the act of brutally murdering their ex as a nightmare, but I digress. Don't fall in love, kids. It's not worth it. Not in an era when electronic romance can be delivered directly to your door. Drunken encounter. The next couple of weeks made all of that look like a vacation. There's always 2 or 3 quiet days between incidents, and this thing somehow manages to pick the exact moment I drop my guard to start screeching. If I'm lucky, the strange sounds are where it stops, but on the bad nights, it's only the beginning. After a particularly hard day, I decided to open my editor's housewarming gift. I don't know much about liquor, but the bottle looked very expensive. I never quite mastered the art of self-control, so I normally avoid alcohol, especially when alone. But at a certain point, you'll do anything to numb the pain. With the amount I consumed, most people would have been on the verge of drunk, but I was drunk. So drunk, in fact, that when I heard the screeching noise, I rushed to turn on all of the outside lights. It was like the sun returning for a late-night encore. That's when I finally got my first full look at this thing. I could say it resembled the Grim Reaper, but that would be misleading. When you think of the Grim Reaper, you probably imagine a skeleton in a black, hooded robe. And this was different. The creature was shrouded in something black. It was like a half-liquid, half-solid, sludgy substance. Dozens of inky tendrils rose from all over the creature's body, like Medusa's snakes. They moved as if they were part of the entity, rather than any type of clothing, even seeming to form its very hands rather than simply covering them. I couldn't tell its fingers apart from the tendrils, or maybe it just had 20 fingers. Who the hell knows? And those eyes, God, was I right about those eyes? 2 large, bulbous red orbs, or set into the half-decomposed skull of a corpse. What little skin that remained was gray and molted, with a few white splotches of exposed bone. There have been some moments where I've caught a whiff of its stench, and there are no words to convey the true horror of that smell. This isn't something I say lightly. I've worked some foul jobs, and I know the rotting stench of death. This was far more vile than such a simple explanation. We probably stared at one another for less than 10 seconds before I remembered to take a picture. But I was shaking uncontrollably and immediately dropped the phone. You're probably all familiar with the sickening sound, the one where your phone collides with the hard floor. It was just enough to pull my eyes away from the creature. I only glanced down for a split second. Yet when I turned back, nothing was there. I was almost drunk enough to go outside. There's no such thing as monsters or cryptids or whatever kids call the boogeyman these days. As far as I knew, that thing was either some nut job in a costume, or my mind had snapped in a horrifically real way. I tend to lean towards the latter, myself, and confronting my hallucination, it seemed like the best thing I could do. If I proved to myself it wasn't real, I could learn to ignore it, get on with my life. I mean, sure, it probably wasn't the healthiest plan, but again, I was drunk and thinking of my deadline. Royce wants chapters 1 through 15 before April. That doesn't leave much time when you still have 14 left to write. Maybe I can combine an element from real life and make Christopher a vampire hunter. Those are still hot, right? Cassidy can be a hot 500-year-old vampire tragically turned at age 21. And all she wants is someone who will appreciate her for who she is on the inside, even if that person has devoted his life to killing her kind. That's the great thing about smut. It truly doesn't matter how your characters end up naked, so long as they stay that way for a few pages. Anyway, if it wasn't obvious by the unnecessary tangent, this is when the next sleep paralysis incident happened. I went to bed just after 11, and the clock said 3:17 when I woke drenched in sweat. Cold beads of moisture ran from my temple to the back of my neck in maddening succession, but I couldn't wipe them away. I couldn't move at all. I was so consumed by that realization of what was happening that it took several seconds before I noticed the screech, the one I'll spend the rest of my life trying to describe in therapy. It sounded different somehow, and at first, I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but then I strained my eyes to the left once again, and my heart froze, mid-beat, at the sight of my worst nightmare. Not only were the floodlights on, my makeshift curtain was flapping in the breeze of an open window, and this time I could see the dark, shadowy figure's red eyes, because they were on my side of the curtain. The motion detectors timed out at the same instant, and the room was left in total darkness, except for those glowing red orbs. I'm not exaggerating when I say my heart came to a full stop. I thought a heart attack would kill me before that thing could. I thought a lot of things in those few seconds, actually. To an extent, most people are familiar with the sensation of processing several possible scenarios in a single instant, but when you truly believe your life is in danger, that effect is magnified tenfold. In those few seconds, I saw my entire life play out like a movie, while I imagined running away from a monster that may or may not be the result of a full mental breakdown. It was too much of a strain to keep my eyes on it. I couldn't help looking away. Yet, upon looking back, the creature was closer. It was just a little easier for my eyes to reach those haunting red orbs, and their angle to the window was just slightly different. But what could I do? Nothing. So I kept staring at its eyes, like we were locked in a deadly game of red light, green light. I have no idea when I fell asleep. It could have been an hour later. It could have been 10 minutes. But it felt like an eternity. Cry for help. All I know for sure is that when I woke up, it was 7:30, and my window was wide open. I like to think I did what any sensible woman would have done, screwed every window shut while crying softly and questioning my sanity. I couldn't stand being alone anymore. I called my best friend, endured the keeping in touch lecture, and spilled my sorry guts. Leslie's always been a practical person. I'm sure she didn't believe me in the beginning, but she listened to my crap recording like a good sport that she is. They sounded like garbage, but she suggested that I call her the next time it happened, and she only had to wait 2 nights. Though it was initially difficult to make out, the sound became much more distinguishable once I cracked the patio door. She couldn't explain it either, but I wasn't expecting her to. I was just relieved someone else had physically heard it. The noise is real. And if that's real, the same has to be true for the thing making it. I've had sleep paralysis several times since the open window incident, but as far as I can tell, it hasn't made its way back inside. I've only seen it one other time, and that was earlier this evening. I was smoking on the patio just before sunset when I looked up to see 2 glowing red eyes staring back at me from inside the tree line. It seemed like it was waiting for the last light to fade, and I had the strangest urge to go to it. If the cherry of my cigarette hadn't fallen on my bare foot, I may not have realized I was actually moving closer. The entire ordeal has me shaken to my core. I'm not cut out for things like this. I have no idea what to do or how to cope. Do I never go outside again? Do I build a fence? Do I get a dog? A gun? What should I do? Christ, I can't believe I've turned into one of those people who seeks comfort from random strangers on the internet. No offense if you are one of those people. I just have major trust issues, in case you couldn't tell. You know what? Never mind. I think I'll just go get that dog after all.